Hello, Internet friends. Let's talk about subjectivism. And the reason why I want to bring this up is because our society is crashing. And when it has completely crashed and it has thinned out the herd, when we rise from the ashes, we want to put ourselves back together in a, normalized way. We want to be able to have our morals and standards and values concrete and not something that's just loosey-goosey, because it's not going to last. The person, with the strictest, most rigid standards is definitely going to be ahead in the game. And guys, I only plan on winning. I do not have a contingency plan for losing. So if anybody wants me to lose, I am so sorry for disappointing you. Anyway, moving on here. So let's talk about saving everybody. I'm just going to add that as a side note. I think in the Bible somewhere it mentions that, you can't save everybody. In this concept, we have to save people and we have to help the weak. I don't know where that comes from. I think that might be Marxist. And yeah, definitely Christianity wants you to help people and help the poor, but it means helping your own poor and not helping other people's poor and ignoring your own. Oh, we live in a pathological age. Anyway, so I came across this recording. I think it's like a Cliff Notes version of this book. It's called The Poison of Subjectivism, and it's by C.S. Lewis, and it's narrated by some fellow with a British accent. I hope you guys enjoy.
The Poison of Subjectivism
by C.S. Lewis.
One cause of misery and vice is always present with us in the greed and pride of men. But at certain periods in history this is greatly increased by the temporary prevalence of some false philosophy. Correct thinking will not make good men of bad ones, but a purely theoretical error may remove ordinary checks to evil and deprive good intentions of their natural support. An error of this sort is abroad at present. I am not referring to the power philosophies of the totalitarian states, but to something that goes deeper and spreads wider, and which, indeed, has given these power philosophies their golden opportunity. I am referring to subjectivism. After studying his environment, man has begun to study himself. Up to that point, he had assumed his own reason, and through it seen all other things. Now his own reason has become the object. It is as if we took out our eyes to look at them. Thus studied, his own reason appears to him as the epiphenomenon which accompanies chemical or electrical events in a cortex which is itself the byproduct of a blind evolutionary process. His own logic, hitherto the king whom events in all possible worlds must obey, becomes merely subjective. There is no reason for supposing that it yields truth. As long as this dethronement refers only to the theoretical reason, it cannot be wholehearted. The scientist has to assume the validity of his own logic, in the stout old fashion of Plato or Spinoza, even in order to prove that it is merely subjective, and therefore he can only flirt with subjectivism. It is true that this flirtation sometimes goes pretty far. There are modern scientists, I am told, who have dropped the words truth and reality out of their vocabulary, and who hold that the end of their work is not to know what is there, but simply to get practical results. This is, no doubt, a bad symptom. But, in the main, subjectivism is such an uncomfortable yokefellow for research that the danger in this quarter is continually counteracted. But when we turn to practical reason, the ruinous effects are found operating in full force. By practical reason, I mean our judgment of good and evil. If you are surprised that I include this under the heading of reason at all, let me remind you that your surprise is itself one result of the subjectivism I am discussing. Until modern times, no thinker of the first rank ever doubted that our judgments of value were rational judgments, or that what they discovered was objective. It was taken for granted that in temptation passion was opposed, not to some sentiment, but to reason. Thus Plato thought, thus Aristotle, thus Hooker, Butler, and Dr. Johnson. The modern view is very different. It does not believe that value judgments are really judgments at all. They are sentiments, or complexes or attitudes produced in a community by the pressure of its environment and its tradition, and differing from one community to another. To say that a thing is good is merely to express our feeling about it, and our feeling about it is the feeling we have been socially conditioned to have. But if this is so, then we might have been conditioned to feel otherwise. Perhaps, thinks the reformer or the educational expert, it would be better if we were. Let us improve our morality. Out of this apparently innocent idea comes the disease that will certainly end our species, and, in my view, damn our souls, if it is not crushed. The fatal superstition that men can create values, that a community can choose its ideology as men choose their clothes. Everyone is indignant when he hears the Germans define justice as that which is to the interest of the Third Reich. But it is not always remembered that this indignation is perfectly groundless if we ourselves regard morality as a subjective sentiment to be altered at will. Unless there is some objective standard of good, overarching Germans, Japanese, and ourselves alike, whether any of us obey it or not, then of course the Germans are as competent to create their ideology as we are to create ours. If good and better are terms deriving their sole meaning from the ideology of each people, then of course ideologies themselves cannot be better or worse than one another. Unless the measuring rod is independent of the things measured, we can do no measuring. For the same reason, it is useless to compare the moral ideas of one age with those of another. Progress and decadence are alike meaningless words. All this is so obvious that it amounts to an identical proposition. But how little it is now understood can be gauged from the procedure of the moral reformer, who, after saying that good means what we are conditioned to like, goes on cheerfully to consider whether it might be better that we should be conditioned to like something else. What in heaven's name does he mean by better? He usually has at the back of his mind the notion that if he throws over traditional judgment or value, he will find something else, something more real or solid, on which to base a new scheme of values. He will say, for example, we must abandon irrational taboos and base our values on the good of the community. As if the maxim, thou shalt promote the good of the community, were anything more than a polysyllabic variant of do as you would be done by, which has itself no other basis than the old universal value judgment he claims to be rejecting. Or he will endeavour to base his values on biology, and tell us that we must act thus and thus for the preservation of our species. Apparently he does not anticipate the question, why should the species be preserved? He takes for granted that it should, because he is really relying on traditional judgments of values. If he were starting, as he pretends, with a clean slate, he could never reach this principle. Sometimes he tries to do so by falling back on instinct. We have an instinct to preserve our species, he may say. But have we? And if we have, who told us that we must obey our instincts? And why should we obey this instinct in the teeth of many others which conflict with the preservation of the species? The reformer knows that some instincts are to be obeyed more than others only because he is judging instincts by a standard, and the standard is, once more, the traditional morality which he claims to be superseding. The instincts themselves obviously cannot furnish us with grounds for grading the instincts in a hierarchy. If you do not bring a knowledge of their comparative respectability to your study of them, you can never derive it from them. This whole attempt to jettison traditional values as something subjective and to substitute a new scheme of values for them is wrong. It is like trying to lift yourself by your own coat collar. Let us get two propositions written into our minds with indelible ink. 1. The human mind has no more power of inventing a new value than of planting a new sun in the sky or a new primary color in the spectrum. 2. Every attempt to do so consists in arbitrarily selecting some one maxim of traditional morality, isolating it from the rest, and erecting it into an unum necessarium. The second proposition will bear a little illustration. Ordinary morality tells us to honor our parents and cherish our children. By taking the second precept alone, You construct a futuristic ethic in which the claims of posterity are the sole criterion. Ordinary morality tells us to keep promises and also to feed the hungry. By taking the second precept alone, you get a communist ethic in which production and distribution of the products to the people are the sole criteria. Ordinary morality tells us, ceteris paribus, to love our kindred and fellow citizens more than strangers. By isolating this precept, you can get either an aristocratic ethic with the claims of our class as sole criterion, or a racialist ethic where no claims but those of blood are acknowledged. These monomaniac systems are then used as a ground from which to attack traditional morality. But absurdly, since it is from traditional morality alone that they derive such semblance of validity as they possess. Starting from scratch, with no assumptions about value, we could reach none of them. If reverence for parents or promises is a mere subjective byproduct of physical nature, so is reverence for race or posterity. The trunk to whose root the reformer would lay the axe is the only support of the particular branch he wishes to retain. All ideas of new or scientific or modern moralities must therefore be dismissed as mere confusion of thought. We have only two alternatives. Either the maxim of traditional morality must be accepted as axioms of practical reason, which neither admit nor require argument to support them, and not to see, which is to have lost human status, or else there are no values at all, what we mistook for values being projections or irrational emotions. It is perfectly futile, after having dismissed traditional morality with the question, why should we obey it, then to attempt the reintroduction of value at some later stage in our philosophy. Any value we reintroduce can be countered in just the same way. Every argument used to support it will be an attempt to derive from premises in the indicative mood a conclusion in the imperative, and this is impossible. A philosophy which does not accept value as eternal and objective can lead us only to ruin. Nor is the matter of merely speculative importance. Many a popular planner on a democratic platform, many a mild-eyed scientist in a democratic laboratory means, in the last resort, just what the fascist means. He believes that good means whatever men are conditioned to approve. He believes that it is the function of him and his kind to condition men, to create consciences by eugenics, psychological manipulation of infants, state education, and mass propaganda. Because he is confused, he does not yet fully realize that those who create conscience cannot be subject to conscience themselves. But he must awake to the logic of his position sooner or later. And when he does, what barrier remains between us and the final division of the race into a few conditioners who stand themselves outside morality, and the many conditioned in whom such morality as the experts choose is produced at the experts' pleasure? If good means only the local ideology, how can those who invent the local ideology be guided by any idea of good themselves? The very idea of freedom presupposes some objective moral law which overarches rulers and ruled alike. Subjectivism about values is eternally incompatible with democracy. We and our rulers are of one kind only so long as we are subject to one law. But if there is no law of nature, the ethos of any society is the creation of its rulers, educators, and conditioners, and every creator stands above and outside his own creation. Unless we return to the crude and nursery-like belief in objective values, we perish. If we do, we may live, and such a return might have one minor advantage. If we believed in the absolute reality of elementary moral platitudes, we should value those who solicit our votes by other standards than have recently been in fashion. While we believe that good is something to be invented, we demand of our rulers such qualities as vision, dynamism, creativity, and the like. If we return to the objective view, we should demand qualities much rarer and much more beneficial: virtue, knowledge, diligence, and skill. Vision is for sale, or claims to be for sale, everywhere. But give me a man who will do a day's work for a day's pay, who will refuse bribes, who will not make up his facts, and who has learned his job.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to your comments below.